So we've gotten a lot of requests for this one. The top 10 athletes who have served in combat. I'll tell you straight out, this could easily be the top 100. I'm sure we'll do a part 2. There's just way too many athletes to cover, so please leave your thoughts in the comments. Some quick ground rules. These are athletes that have served in actual combat. And while these types of lists are subjective, for this one I weighed 3 factors. First, the intensity of the combat, such as wounds or acts of heroism. Second, the circumstances. Did the combat interrupt their career? Did it come before or did it come after? And third, the magnitude or greatness of the athlete. Were they ordinary jocks or were they Hall of Famers? Again, just some guiding principles for you to be aware of. This is all subjective and they're all heroes. I can't state that enough. They're all heroes. Again, leave your thoughts in the comments, so let's get started. Bob Feller. There's a few Hall of Famers on this list, but Bob Feller isn't just a Hall of Famer. He's an all-timer, meaning an all-time great. How great is great? In his major league debut, he struck out 15 guys, and he was only a high school junior. Guy was 17 years old, still in high school, never pitched a single inning in the minor leagues, and he fans 15 players in his first outing. Now that is unreal. Bob Feller had 100 wins by his 21st birthday and finished his career with 266 wins, which could have been closer to 400 had he not lost 4 years to the war. He dominated almost every statistical category for most of his career, and he threw so hard that it's estimated that on today's radar gun, his fastball would have been 106 miles per hour. Now that is fast. But if you want to know about the man's character, keep this in mind. Bob Feller was coming off a 1941 season, which saw him lead the majors in wins, strikeouts, and innings pitched. And on December 7th, 1941, he was actually driving from his house in Iowa to Cleveland to sign a new contract when he heard over the car radio that Pearl Harbor had been attacked. So what does he do? He promptly turns his car around and enlists in the Navy the very next day, making him the first baseball player to enlist. He didn't waste any time. He didn't hesitate. He put his career on hold to serve his country. And Bob served with distinction on the USS Alabama, a battleship which saw combat throughout the Pacific. And get this, in his first game back in late 1945, he proceeds to pitch a complete game victory with 12 strikeouts. No minor league starts, no pitch counts, just a complete game after being discharged just days earlier. That is so amazing. There are so many parallels between Bob Feller and Ted Williams. In my estimation, he was every inch the pitcher that Ted Williams was a hitter. In fact, both lost their prime years to the war, in Williams' case, 2 wars. But their stats would have been so much greater if they didn't miss that time, and neither ever complained about it. More on Teddy Ballgame in a bit. Lloyd Mangrum. I'm guessing that outside of hardcore golf nerds like myself, very few of you have heard of Lloyd Mangrum. Now, Lloyd wasn't just a good golfer, he was a great golfer. He won 36 PGA Tour events, including the US Open, and he was a 4-time Ryder Cup member and a playing captain. But what's most impressive about the guy is after enlisting in the Army, he was given the chance to be the golf pro at Fort Meade Golf Course. Keep in mind, he had already won 5 professional events by this point, but he turned it down and insisted on seeing combat. Lloyd was part of Patton's Third Army and received not 1 but 2 Purple Hearts for severe wounds during battle, including a smashed up arm that doctors said would preclude him from ever playing golf again. Well, not only did he play golf again, he actually won the US Open in 1946, besting Ben Hogan, Sam Snead, Byron Nelson, and many others. It's sad that most PGA Tour players today have no idea who Lloyd Mangrum is, but they should. He's 12th all-time on the PGA Tour win list, and he was a bona fide World War II hero and badass. Tom Landry. If you're of a certain age, you remember Tom Landry as the stoic man on the sidelines of the Dallas Cowboys, dressed in those neatly tailored suits and wearing that fedora hat. He never smiled. He never seemed to show any emotion, really, good or bad. Whether you like the Cowboys or not, and I'm a New York Giants fan, so I go in the not category, there's no denying his coaching greatness and how disciplined those Cowboys teams were. Until we did a short on him a few months ago, I had no idea how much of a badass and a war hero Tom Landry really was. Before he was Tom Landry, stern disciplinarian of America's team, he was Second Lieutenant Tommy Landry, B-17 pilot who flew 30 combat missions over continental Europe during World War II. By all accounts, Lieutenant Tommy Landry was an excellent pilot. In fact, his crew called him Mr. Ice because he seemingly never got rattled up there. Like all bomber crews that flew that many missions, they got shot up a lot. There were many near misses. And in Landry's case, he safely crash landed in Belgium without injuring anybody. I'm a diehard football fan, at least I used to be, and grew up watching Landry, and never once did any commentator ever say anything about his astonishing war record or his heroism. Not surprisingly, Landry never spoke of it either. Late in life, someone asked him how he kept his cool on the sidelines all those years, and he simply responded, "When you've belly landed a plane in combat, third and long doesn't seem so daunting." Amen, Tommy Landry, amen. Jerry Coleman. The name Jerry Coleman may be recognizable to some of you, especially if you're a San Diego Padres fan. You know him as the legendary play-by-play radio man for over 4 decades. He also had a very distinguished playing career as an all-star second baseman for the Yankees and a World Series MVP in 1950. In fact, he won 4 rings total with the Yankees as part of those dynastic teams of the 50s with Mickey Mantle, Yogi Berra, Whitey Ford, and the rest of them. But here's a trivia fact you didn't know. Jerry Coleman is the only Major League player who saw combat in both World War II and Korea. Now, before you tell me that Ted Williams did too, Ted didn't actually see combat in World War II. He was a Marine aviation instructor in Pensacola, but he didn't fly any combat missions during the Second World War. Of course, he did in Korea, and much more on Teddy Ballgame in a bit, but Coleman is the only major leaguer to see actual combat in both wars. And not just a little combat, by the way. The guy flew 57 missions during World War II as a dive bomber and 63 missions during the Korean War, which included 2 near-death experiences. And let that sink in for a second. Guy flew a total of 120 missions, and these weren't milk runs. Jerry Coleman probably saw more intense combat than any professional athlete in history if you look at the duration and the danger level. And add that to the fact that he was a very accomplished player and a Hall of Fame announcer, and you got the real deal badass on your hands. He could very easily be number 1 on this list. It's all subjective, but boy, do I love Jerry Coleman. What a man that guy was, unbelievable. Ted Williams, Teddy Ballgame, the Splendid Splinter. Many of you already know about Ted Williams' astounding war record that he served during 2 wars, which essentially cost him 5 seasons in his prime. I mean, imagine what his stats would be if he had those additional 5 seasons. He might still own every hitting record in Major League Baseball. As I mentioned earlier in discussing Jerry Coleman's, Williams didn't see combat during World War II. He was a Marine aviation instructor in Pensacola during much of the war. But when he was recalled by the Marines to fly jets during the Korean War, he did see combat, flying a total of 39 missions as John Glenn's wingman. Yes, that John Glenn. And these were no milk runs either. These were real missions. In fact, he got hit on multiple occasions and even survived a very tough landing. An amazing war record on Teddy Ballgame, just unbelievable. It's just hard to comprehend that one day he's the best player in Major League Baseball, and the next day he's flying jets in combat. I can't imagine that happening today. Nobody would ever do that. But he served his country without complaint when he was asked to, and he put his life on hold and he put his life on the line. You know, Ted sometimes got a bum rap from the media for being a bit prickly or standoffish, but in reality, he should have been praised by the media. He was a badass's badass, just a one-of-a-kind American hero. He deserves so much better than the way the media and sometimes even the fans treated him. There will never, ever be another Teddy Ballgame. Rocky Bleier, The Rock. I just love this guy so much. Everything about him, his name, his toughness, his legacy on and off the field. Unlike many on this list, his story is pretty well known, at least among a certain generation. Rocky Bleier is one of those guys that was counted out his entire life. He was too small, too slow, not flashy. He was a walk-on at Notre Dame, and even though he put up some pretty solid numbers, he wasn't drafted by the Steelers until the 16th round. And yes, there were 16 rounds to the NFL draft back then. He wasn't supposed to make the Steelers team, but somehow he did, probably on guts and tenacity. He wasn't supposed to get any playing time his rookie season, but he carved out a nice niche on special teams and as a blocking back. So he's living the dream, playing pro football, when he's drafted by the Army. Now, back at a time when a lot of important people in all walks of life were finding very creative ways to get out of the draft, not only did Rocky Bleier not do that, He then volunteered to see combat in Vietnam versus taking a non-combat role, which was offered to him. I mean, you want to talk about a stand-up guy. Now that is hardcore stand-up. Just 3 months after deploying, Rocky was shot through one leg and took grenade shrapnel to the other leg. After hours of surgery in Tokyo to remove 100 pieces of shrapnel from his legs, Army doctors told him his football days were over and that he'd be lucky to walk again. So he's laying in a hospital bed, recuperating from surgery, when he gets a telegram from Art Rooney, the Steelers' owner. "Rock," it says, "the team isn't doing so well. We need you back." And that's all it took for Rocky Bleier to practically will his way back into the NFL. And what's amazing is he didn't just have a nice career, he had a great career. The guy played for 10 seasons, contributed to 4 Super Bowl titles, turned in a 1,000-yard season alongside Hall of Famer Franco Harris, and won the respect of fans everywhere. Rocky Bleier, what an amazing guy. Jack Lummus. Jack Lummus is a very special man, a very special situation. He's the only athlete on our list to receive the Medal of Honor. It's hard not to get choked up talking about this guy, and if I do, I apologize. Jack was a 2-sport star at Ballard in football and baseball, in fact, an All-American in both sports. He decided to make football his career and was a wide receiver, they called them ends back then, on the 1941 New York Giants team that lost in the championship game to the Chicago Bears. Just days after the championship game, he enlisted in the Marine Corps, and he'd go on to be one of 27 Marines to receive the Medal of Honor during the Battle of Iwo Jima. Despite suffering wounds from grenade shrapnel, he managed to knock out 3 Japanese strongholds before stepping on a landmine. It blew off both of his legs, but he didn't die instantly. He was actually on the operating table, and his last words were, "Well, Doc, the Giants lost a mighty good end today." God bless you, Jack Lummus. Pat Tillman. You know, we get a lot of comments about how unique our greatest generation heroes were, especially the athletes and the movie stars that interrupted their lucrative careers to serve their countries. That we wouldn't find that today, and that's mostly true. We've had nearly 2 decades of war following 9/11, and we didn't see anyone from Hollywood or many pro athletes rushing to enlist. But we did see one, Pat Tillman. You know, when Pat decided to quit pro football, he was trending towards being an elite safety and was on the cusp of signing a multi-million-dollar contract. He certainly was entering his prime, and his best years were ahead of him for sure. For him to turn down the money and effectively end his career when he didn't have to is as badass as anything from the greatest generation. Remember, there was no draft going on. Certainly nobody else was quitting pro sports to enlist, and yet Pat Tillman never gave it a second thought. Look, his story is well known. We know he died from a friendly fire incident. We know the Army has been less than forthcoming about the circumstances. We know that at some point he lost confidence in the Army's leadership. And to this day, there's still much speculation as to what really happened to Pat Tillman. I'm not going to rehash it all. Google it if you want to learn more. I'd rather focus on what a selfless hero Pat Tillman was for making the decision to cut short a very promising career to come to the aid of his country during a very dark hour. That's who Pat Tillman was, and that's the example he set. When we say they don't make them like the greatest generation heroes anymore, again, that's mostly true, they don't, but not entirely true. Then there's the case of Pat Tillman. Bob Kalsu. I'll confess, I had no idea who Bob Kalsu was before I researched this video, and I'm ashamed of that. I'm a sports nut and a historian, and I pride myself in knowing these more obscure stories. But Bob Kalsu should be a household name, and I should have known who he was. For starters, he was the only athlete to die during the Vietnam War, and prior to Pat Tillman, he was the last pro athlete to die in combat. Kalsu was an All-American offensive lineman with the Oklahoma Sooners when he was drafted by the Buffalo Bills. He started for the Bills his rookie season, a rarity back then, and was named the team's Rookie of the Year. By all accounts, he had a very promising career in front of him. He wasn't just an ordinary player. Bob was a special guy. He was a member of ROTC while at Oklahoma, and he decided to fulfill his ROTC obligations by accepting a commission and deploying to Vietnam when he could have easily gotten out of it. Bob was a platoon leader in the 101st Airborne when he was killed by a mortar attack in July 1970. His second child was born on the very next day. I mean, it was beyond heartbreaking. Sometimes we forget all the good things about this country, but Bob Kalsu is a reminder of what is good about America. He was a man of his word. He was devoted to his country. He played football the right way. He lived up to his commitments, and he died serving alongside his brothers. I really think Bob Kalsu should be a household name, and I think the NFL should do way more to honor him. He deserves it. Before we go on to number one, some honorable mentions here. Hank Greenberg, one of the most prolific home run hitters of the 30s and 40s. He was actually the first major league player to be drafted in early 1941 before Pearl Harbor. After serving a few months in the Army, he was actually discharged when they changed the draft age. But after Pearl Harbor, he re-enlisted in the Army Air Force and spent the duration of the war on active duty. He missed 5 years of his amazing career to serve as an incredible role model. Unreal. Larry Doby, he was the second person to break the color barrier and the first to join Major League Baseball directly from the Negro Leagues. He served in the Navy and saw active combat in the Pacific for much of the war. The guy was a 7-time All-Star and had a Hall of Fame career. Yogi Berra, he was drafted by the Yankees in 1943 and put his baseball career on hold to join the Navy. Yogi was a gunner's mate on the attack transport USS Bayfield and saw action in the waters off of Utah Beach on D-Day. In fact, he was hit in the hand by gunfire and received a Purple Heart for it. Bobby Jones, one of the greatest golfers of all time, was also at Normandy on June 7, 1944, with the Army Air Force as an interrogator or prisoner of war. He was 40 years old at the time and sought a commission with the caveat that he be sent overseas and see actual combat. Now that is just badass. Alejandro Villanueva, you know him. He played football at West Point and did 3 tours of duty in Afghanistan before finally making the Pittsburgh Steelers roster after several failed attempts to break into the NFL. He would become a standout offensive lineman and stood alone in front of the national anthem when the rest of his team did not come out of the tunnel. His jersey is still one of the most popular in the NFL. And there's so many others: Grover Cleveland Alexander, Warren Spahn, Gino Marchetti, the boxers Joe Louis and Jack Dempsey and Rocky Marciano, Chuck Bednarik. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. I'm sure there'll be a part 2 of this, probably even a part 3. There's just too many athletes to cover. And finally, we come to Al Blozis, truly one of the most extraordinary people I've ever heard of. It's pretty amazing to think that the NFL football giants didn't have just one hero. They actually had 2 on the same roster. Like Jack Lummus, Al Blozis was a 2-sport star in college, football and shot put. He would have been the favorite to win Olympic gold in 1940, actually, if the games hadn't been canceled. In fact, he won the NCAA indoor and outdoor shot put championships 3 years in a row while at Georgetown, my alma mater. He's considered one of the greatest shot putters of all time, and it wasn't even the guy's best sport. Al was a hulking figure, 6'6", 250, which back then was gigantic. He was an All-American 2-way player, and his 2+ seasons in the NFL, he was an all-league defensive tackle. Many NFL historians believe that if Blozis had lived, he would have been one of the all-time great defensive linemen. He was just big, he was fast, he was fundamentally sound. I think he's one of the few guys from that era that actually can play the modern game. In many ways, he was the prototype of the big, lean, fast, explosive defensive ends and linebackers. Kind of sort of reminds me of J.J. Watt. His story is so poignant because initially he wasn't eligible to be in the Army. He was too big. The Army actually had a rule restricting guys that large from joining combat. He pleaded with the Army to take him, and finally, after the 1943 season, his second in the NFL, they relented and he was allowed to join the Army. They initially assigned him to a desk job, but again, he begged them to see combat, and they again relented, and he was sent to Europe. Al tragically died in early 1945 while searching for 2 missing buddies during the Battle of Vosges Mountains. When they found his frozen body, it was riddled with 38 bullets in it. He was a big target, probably why the Army didn't want him to be in combat. Al Blozis' story is truly one of the most remarkable in sports history. You know, we get a lot of comments on this channel about standing for the national anthem, And as you know, we don't talk politics here. But when you stand for the national anthem, you're standing up for guys like Al Blozis, a true American hero. Tell me what you think in the comments. Till next time, I'm Nick Ragone.